Thank you very much, Mr. President and Chancellor, friends. It's a wonderful a privilege to be here with you today and for these 3 days of important considerations. Thank you also, Your Eminence, Cardinal Kasper, for beginning our discussions with such a rich presentation that gives us much to draw on. I hope that I will be able to make at least a very small contribution to the discussions going forward, if not be at the level that we began. So in my paper, I try to explore what I regard as a complicated and ambiguous relationship between the idea of universal human rights and the idea of a nation state with its own particular identity, history, and culture. I do so from the disciplinary perspective of law, mine, in particular comparative constitutional law and international human rights law, by examining the basis of claims of what I call national constitutionalism, and focusing on the tradition of the United States in particular, comparing that with perspectives that identify as a more transnational constitutionalism. Historically, the emergence of human rights as a coherent and powerful political idea was strongly associated with the formation and independence and self-rule of nation states. Whether in terms of the guarantees of the rights of Englishmen, or in the liberal unification of nations like Italy in the 19th century, or in the push for widespread national self-determination in the global politics of the early 20th century, or even in the movements of decolonization after the Second World War, one consistent and deeply rooted strand of political practice and political theory has seen the realization of human rights as best served by attending precisely to the idea of autonomous and self-governing nations, each one providing its people with the capacity to chart their own course, to frame their own values and priorities, and to affirm their own collective identity. Constitutionalism, including its implicit requirement of democracy, is the vehicle for effectively realizing national aspirations to establish collective identity, and also to bring about the rule of law and the protection of rights. Yet, at the same time, of course, from the beginning, the modern idea of human rights and its claims framed in terms of abstract universal values has also been infused with a universalism that transcends the specific and contingent cultural or historical contexts and particularities of national identity. Human rights, from this perspective, claim to stand outside of, and at times even against, the nation and the state. While this was already clearly true in the thought of the 18th century proponents of the rights of man, it became the dominant mode of conceptualizing human rights in the latter half of the 20th century, with the advent of the global project of universal human rights. Precisely in order to advance that aspiration of global acceptance, human rights in the post-1945 world order were articulated and instantiated in law in forms that separated them from the distinctiveness of any particular national identities or traditions of law and constitutionalism. The historical reasons for that emphasis are obvious and center on an interpretation of Germany's aggression and genocide as being the products of a virulent strain of nationalism rooted in an ideology of racial supremacy. Human rights in the post-war era were supposed to serve as the checks on those impulses by fixing certain universal principles on the inviolable dignity of the human person. Once human rights in this form were situated in the constellation of areas of international concern, in consequence, they became pitted against the nation state in other ways as well. By raising each state's internal affairs to a common level of international concern, the global recognition of universal human rights disrupted and conditioned state sovereignty, diminishing it from the near absolute status it had in the 19th century positivist vision of the state. Universality in this vision consistently tends to be seen as a requirement of uniformity with respect to the protection of rights. thus flattening the differences between nations across the many areas touching on fundamental values and principles. The need for strong and effective states in the post-1945 order has remained clear and obvious, notwithstanding these developments. The international human rights system depends on them in many ways for the implementation and protection of rights. At a theoretical level, this has been recognized in different ways by various philosophers of law and politics. For example, Hannah Arendt argued that the right to have rights entailed the necessity of an individual belonging to a specific political community in order to have her rights recognized and protected. Jürgen Habermas, theorizing from very different premises and arguing for a full constitutionalization of the global community, nevertheless coincides in his judgment about the necessity of states as the constituent units of that order. In this, he strongly echoes Kant, whose perpetual peace, although understood today as a manifesto of cosmopolitanism, is in fact based on the idea of a federation of independent republican states. And beyond theory, of course, in practice, weak and distant international human rights institutions rely on states as the primary guarantors of the rights of individuals and local communities. In short, universal human rights legitimate and justify states, even while relativizing their sovereignty. The national state, however, is a different and somewhat more problematic matter. Insofar as it implies an affirmation of the particularity of the nation and its identity, the nation-state seems to be inevitably in tension with the dominant vision of human rights in the post-1945 era. Yet the triumph of abstract formulations of universal human rights as the common currency of global ethical discourse has not eliminated the persistence of claims of national identity. Indeed, arguably, the hegemony of the ideology of human rights has sometimes provoked more reactions from a wide variety of nations seeking to affirm the particularity of their identities and traditions in the face of, and sometimes even against, global human rights norms. We saw this in the 1980s and 1990s, for example, in the debates over so-called Asian values and international human rights. African nations have periodically insisted on the recognition of their unique cultural fingerprint with respect to human rights and have resisted, for example, the demands of the International Criminal Court, in part by affirming their preference for national approaches to criminal justice and peace and reconciliation. More recently, we increasingly see examples of political leaders and domestic legal institutions, from Buenos Aires to Brunei, resisting the demands of the global human rights regimes and giving priority to national constitutional particularity over global standards, often invoking the distinctiveness of national characteristics and identity. One could even speculate reasonably that as the pressure of universal human rights increases, it proportionately provokes a certain opposite reaction of nationalism. So in an era of new and resurgent nationalisms around the world in general, which we are examining collectively in these 3 days, it would be useful to understand better the relationship between the protection of human rights as universal values and the idea of nation states as the locus of expression of national distinctiveness and particularity. Is there in fact an irreducible tension between them, or is there a way to harmonize and reconcile the two? Given that aim, I will not here treat the many examples of states whose resistance to international human rights, norms, processes, and institutions is obviously a pretext for evading accountability and for justifying authoritarian rule. Nor am I concerned with what Tom Ginsburg and other scholars have recently called sham constitutionalism. Nationalist authoritarianism and sham constitutionalism are certainly serious problems, but they are different problems than the one I'm trying to identify and discuss. The cases of more importance for my purposes are those where a sincere, however inconsistent and imperfect, commitment to the protection of fundamental rights seems to coexist with a relatively strong affirmation of distinctive national identity. I will unsystematically call this national constitutionalism, to distinguish it from a constitutionalism that we could call transnational because it accords higher priority and legitimacy to global norms of human rights than to national norms and structures. Now, the constitutional tradition of the United States has been one of the most enduring examples of democracy in the world, and a constitutional order founded on the idea of individual natural rights. And yet, for the last 70 years, it has also been one of the most paradigmatic examples of a constitutional tradition that to a certain and consistent degree prioritizes national constitutionalism and resists some of the core premises of transnational constitutionalism. So can we, by delving a little more deeply into the US example, begin to arrive at an understanding of both universal human rights and nation states that is more nuanced and constructive rather than only oppositional and reactive? Is there something useful that we can learn more generally from the US example for how to reconcile the competing goods of the universal recognition of human dignity and human rights on the one hand, and the nationalist claims of self-determination, self-government, and the identity in a nation state on the other? Now, before proceeding further, let me try first to make very clear the scope and limits of what I'm trying to do in order to avoid a possible misunderstanding. In focusing on the United States, I in no way intend to suggest that its constitutional system is categorically superior, exemplary, that it does not merit serious reproach or criticism. On the contrary, there are various aspects of the US approach that I do believe are quite problematic. And it's common knowledge that in its historical practice, the United States has had a constitutional identity full of contradictions and failures to abide by its own ideals. None of that is contested by me, but none of it either prevents us from asking whether we can nevertheless extract from its example of an enduring, generally rights-protecting constitutional democracy some insight into the relationship between national identity and human rights. So it's a commonplace to note that the United States is one of the most persistently resistant countries to the subjection of its laws and practices to the supervision and control of international human rights treaties and institutions. This is not at all something new introduced by the Trump era's America First style of nationalism, but has in fact been more or less true across the entire 70-year history of the global human rights project. And I give various examples forward, but in the interest of time and reducing, I will skip the details of that. Most observers, activists, as political as well as scholarly, tend to ascribe this resistance, explicitly or tacitly, more or less entirely to the long American history of exceptionalism and isolationism with respect to the world. Now, American closure towards the international is lamentably present, without doubt. But pointing to that alone begs further questions about the sources and scope of that American difference, and it fails to take into account other factors that make the picture more complex. For instance, a fuller account of American postures with regard to international human rights would need to factor in various structural constitutional conditions that make it more difficult, deliberately, to participate in the international order. Those are a little more tangential to my point, so I won't go into the details. But aside from such structural questions, one could point to the many examples in which comparative legal study has revealed distinctively American approaches to a broad range of specific fundamental rights, including freedom of speech, freedom of religion, privacy, criminal process and punishment, just to name a few. Such substantive differences in understanding of rights are not themselves the focus of my interest, but they begin to approach the underlying factor I seek to isolate and explore. The observation that different understandings of the content and scope of human rights norms are one of the important factors in explaining the divergent American attitude towards international human rights is interesting not only in a direct way, that is because of the substance of the difference, but also because it implies, to at least a degree, the conviction that American understandings should be, in general, at least by default, preferred, exactly because they originate distinctively in American historical, cultural, political, and social sources. That is, in the traditions, practices, and identity of the American people as a self-governing democratic nation. The understandings of international bodies, or the international community as such, are seen to be less important, less authoritative than those understandings of rights that are American, precisely by virtue of their being international and American, respectively. This is not to deny the presence and importance in the American tradition of the idea of self-evident rights, in the sense that Jefferson and Paine trumpeted them. Intermingled with that universalist Enlightenment sentiment, however, there has always been also the notion championed by Edmund Burke, in reaction to the ideology of the French Revolution, that rights are real rights only when, like the ancient rights of Englishmen, they are concretely grounded in and emerge from a distinctive national history and social fabric. This finally brings me to the main point of this section. We can say that a critical part of what is at issue when we examine American attitudes and policies regarding international human rights is a particular understanding of the relationship between a nation and its rights, its democracy, and its national identity. One influential American tradition of law and politics, at least, is more likely to regard rights as acquiring their significance, their meaning and importance, in the crucible of the national legal and political sphere than through supranational processes or transnational consensus. Accordingly, international or foreign understandings of rights are less likely to carry weight, especially weight that rests on the authority putatively derived from their transnationality as such. But for many players in the international milieu, and particularly among human rights activists and scholars, the exact opposite is true. That is, insofar as rights are drafted, determined, defined, and developed at a transnational level, or through supranational institutions, they are, by virtue of the fact of transnationality alone, thought to be more authoritative and more legitimate, and are less likely to be contested. This difference represents the distinct ways of conceptualizing the relationship between rights, nation, and communal identity. Now, in the next section, again, for the interest of time, I will not read it, but what I try to do is to help explain the roots of this American difference by going back to the thought of Alexis de Tocqueville and his first fascination with, his examination and study of American democracy, the fact that democracy in America was focused both on the protection of rights, what he saw as fixed points of order, and also on a form of social ordering that is highly based on local freedom, that bubbles up from below in its sense of democracy. And one of the enduring questions that he dealt with throughout democracy in America was exactly how do these things remain together coherently, right? In the American dispensation. And he concludes, as I do at the bottom of page 8, that national democratic political life is the practical art of mediating between the social freedom of local communities and the order of rights, those fixed points of stability, between concrete particularity, on the one hand, local freedom, and abstract universals, the rights of man. Now, it's common to observe, working from there then, now on the top of page 9, in the theories of democracy, it's common to observe that fundamental rights can often serve two distinct purposes. On the one hand, they are substantive principles specifying the content of basic requirements of justice and the common good. In this sense, they serve as restraints on the exercise of the authority of the majority, without which democracy can become majoritarian tyranny. But on the other hand, rights serve as mechanisms to protect the capacity of the people to govern themselves. They enhance self-government through the protection of liberties necessary to genuine representation and participation in the determination of the good of the community. So the first purpose leads to a conception of rights that is more oriented towards objective values, toward the recognition and protection of basic human goods, and are often said to be more dignitarian in orientation. The second purposes tend to be more process-oriented, thinner in their expression of basic human goods, but constitutive of the participatory and deliberative aspects of democracy. They guarantee freedom and the rule of law and are commonly thought of as more libertarian in their orientation. Now, it should be apparent that these two purposes of rights, ensuring self-government and providing the objective value orientations of the body politic, can sometimes be in tension with one another, just as Tocqueville intuited in his historic study. Where rights are used to circumscribe the boundaries of legitimate political choices by reference to objective values, by definition, they constitute a certain limitation on the freedom of self-government, of the majority, to be sure. Using Dworkin's terms, they are then trumps against societal choices, and I don't mean any pun by reference to Trumps there. They're trumps against societal choices that don't accord adequate respect for the moral worth of every individual. But there's nothing particularly new or insightful in making that observation, but it is interesting, I think, to note how this counter-majoritarian thrust of appeals to fundamental rights is not just anti-democratic. After all, that's exactly what fundamental rights are supposed to be, in recognition of the need for democracy to be oriented in substance toward basic principles of justice and the common good. But in some degree, it is even an anti-political approach. It is premised on the perceived need to remove the basic values represented by rights from the sphere of politics altogether. In other words, from this perspective, the protection of human rights entails the withdrawal of certain basic questions of social life from the potential dilution and corruption of values by political actors, including, but not limited to, majorities within nation states. This is one of the principal driving forces behind the judicialization of rights, the removal of those areas of common life staked out by rights that are deemed to be fundamental to the apolitical principled institutions of the courts of law. Now, one problem with this dichotomy between the two areas of rights, or two purposes of rights in democratic life, is that it ignores certain ways in which the two dimensions in modern democracies are not entirely distinct and divisible. They're interconnected in various ways. Let me just summarize two of the following four ways in which I try to tie them together. The first is, of course, that the participatory aspects of rights and of democracy are not entirely distinguishable from the substantive and dignity-oriented human goods, because part of the substance of human flourishing is exactly to participate in the determination of one's own and the community's basic decisions about the goods of their lives. This is practical reasonableness in John Finnis's language, or perhaps phronesis, using an Aristotelian vocabulary. Secondly, the two dimensions are also connected in a more functional way. Each one is necessary to the realization of the other. How does a political community determine and prioritize the areas of human dignity in its community that need to be fixed and set aside, except through the processes of political discourse and dialogue and debate? And here, whether we're talking about a Habermasian emphasis on communicative conditions for the formation of political will, or Sen's analysis, this is supported both by empirical examination as well as theoretical reflection. So for these two reasons and a couple others that I mentioned, there are multiple connections between the two dimensions of rights. And so there we hear the echo of Tocqueville emphasizing that the rich social life that he observed at local levels in America generates the mores that sustain democracy. So in the art of democracy, as he called it, the political and the social are as deeply intertwined as the idea of individual rights and the taste for local freedom. The idea of self-government as related to rights, therefore, is not merely the affirmation of a substantively empty or purely procedural political autonomy. It represents the respect, promotion, and protection of the jurisgenerative politics and communities which give life to the virtues that sustain liberty, equality, the rule of law, and democracy. So given these relationships between a national politics of law and fundamental rights, it's to be expected that specific constitutional systems can take quite divergent form in seeking to realize both the stable protection of certain objective universal values and also the virtues of self-government. While the US constitutional tradition has tended frequently to privilege the latter, self-government, in the post-1945 era, most continental European constitutional systems have balanced the equation more in favor of the objective order of values that remove fundamental questions from political self-rule and from the expression of national identity. Indeed, it may be reasonable to interpret one, among others to be sure, of the causes of the backlash against European regional institutions in places like the United Kingdom to be a perception that the Europe of rights has excessively intruded upon and displaced the vital importance of national self-determination. This observation highlights the link between self-government and the political expression of the idea of nation more generally. The self-rule orientation of rights represents the means by which a people will deliberate, choose, and express their fundamental value orientations and priorities, and their collective identity as a nation. So it will tend to be more aligned with a nationalist reading and implementation of constitutional order. Conversely, the objective order of values that are to be fixed and removed from political vicissitudes will often be perceived as constraints, legitimate constraints perhaps, but constraints nevertheless, on the ability to make those same value choices that are expressive of national identity. They will therefore tend to be in greater tension with the idea of national constitutionalism and more consonant with a transnational constitutionalism that is abstracted from and less expressive of national particularity and identity. All of this in turn suggests to me a further working hypothesis about rights and the nation state. A disproportionate or unbalanced emphasis on objective universal values at the expense of self-government may pose a problem for the full realization of human rights and for the resolution of certain problems of law and justice. To see how this might be so, in the next section, I engage in an analysis, next two sections of international human rights, which in the interest of time, I will have to condense a fair amount. First of all, I point to the idea of subsidiarity as the structural core of how the human rights system ought to be reconciling the ideas of local freedom or self-government and a substantive vision of human dignity and the universal common good. But as I begin to point out, though, despite that sort of structural concern for both, in theory, in the arrangements and systems of international human rights law, the appreciation for self-governance has not, in fact, been the stronger partner in the development of human rights ideas. Now, in part because the international system of protection was born out of what I call the original sin of failed and criminal domestic political institutions. So there has been, I think, and I explain in a little bit more detail in the paper, an atrophied attention to the structures of self-government in international human rights law, and a correspondingly stronger focus only on the objective order of values that human rights norms represent. In the international sphere, above all, this has, I think, some problematic consequences over the long run. It has been tremendously successful to have such a focus on taking objective values and translating them into positive law over 70 years. But at the same time, it results in a law that has a very thin practical consensus beneath it, right? one that was pointed out in the historical study of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that many of us are familiar with. And those difficulties result in, for example, a widespread gap between international norms and instruments of human rights law and law at the social and local level, the political cultures in which they're supposed to be operative in practice. It also results in a second problem, that the thinness of the cultural basis of human rights law becomes incapable of generating the conditions and commitments necessary to sustain the pre-political values that make law effective. This is exactly the point that, that Cardinal Kasper was raising, citing Birkenforde. And here, again, because of the lack of time, I'll be very synthetic and go to my conclusions. The thinness of human rights foundations and the lack of the attention to self-government results in a system that, that is less effective than we would like it to be, right? Because it doesn't have the social and political foundations, and results in a system that tends to be much more elitist and bureaucratic and proceduralist. Exactly things that then provoke a certain kind of populist reaction to them. So in conclusion, and I'm pulling in the threads now on the final pages. I believe, Mr. President, I have about 2 more minutes. Yeah, thank you. First, I've tried to demonstrate in this paper that one of the more important factors in explaining the greater emphasis in the United States on national constitutionalism and its resistance to transnational constitutionalism is due to the persistence of an attention or concern for the importance of self-government, for the art of democracy and a taste for local freedom. And secondly, I offered a critical assessment of the international sphere of human rights to suggest that an atrophied attentiveness to those same questions of local freedom and national self-governance are problematic. Now, this line of thought suggests, first of all, that we have to take seriously the desire of national communities to retain meaningful degrees of self-governance, because if not, it is only likely that more extreme and exclusionary forms of nationalism will be fed by their rhetorical and political opposition to the idea of human rights as recognized and protected by international norms. And they will provoke hostile reactions to the idea of universal human rights as a whole. But to be clear, I do not suggest that we seek to replace a way of thinking about and using rights in a more transnationally oriented way with an equally reductive concern only for national self-government and localism. I would be very critical of the American constitutional emphasis on that in a different context or a different paper. Instead, I think it's necessary to seek means to bring the two forms together in a way that takes them both seriously, that keeps them in dialectical tension without either destroying the other. So, because I have to close, I will close there.